When I first moved into Mark's house, I told myself it was the start of a calmer chapter. After years of scraping by alone, I wanted stillness, not excitement. Mark offered that stability, predictability, a kind of quiet devotion that came in the form of bills paid on time and dinners eaten in silence. The house itself felt too large at first, every hallway echoing with someone else's history. The framed pictures of his late wife remained on a few walls, polite reminders that I was a guest inside a life already half-written. Ethan, his son, met me at the doorway with a cautious handshake. 19 tall, eyes too serious for his age. He nodded more than he spoke, and I mistook that for acceptance. Only later did I learn that silence could mean resistance. I wanted to be gentle with him, to prove I wasn't an intruder. I told myself patience would mend everything. The first few weeks were a routine of politeness. We passed each other in the kitchen like strangers in a hotel. I'd cook breakfast, leave an extra plate for him, and find it untouched hours later. Mark would mention homework, curfews, weekend shifts at the coffee shop. I'd listen, smile, and feel myself shrinking into the background. It was easier that way. Blending and caused less friction. But inside, a small ache kept whispering that I was invisible. Mark worked long hours, sometimes not returning until after midnight. He'd fall asleep on the couch, phone still glowing in his hand. I never accused him of neglect. He wasn't cruel or dishonest. He was simply absent, as if marriage had become another task to maintain. We had affection, but not connection. The distance between us felt like water clear, silent, impossible to cross. The swimming pool in the backyard became my refuge. The surface was always still in the mornings, glassy and blue. I'd slip in just after sunrise, when the neighborhood still slept. The water softened everything, the noise in my head, the weight in my chest. For a while, I could forget that I was trying too hard to belong. Sometimes, while I floated on my back, I'd catch the faint reflection of the house windows. Curtains drawn, faint light inside, nothing unusual. Still, a prickling sensation crept over me, as if the air itself had eyes. I'd laugh it off, telling myself I was being dramatic. After all, paranoia thrives in lonely hearts. Ethan rarely joined us for dinner, but when he did, conversation hovered around safe topics, classes, work, weather. His voice was measured, his words careful, like someone translating feelings from a language he didn't trust. Once, he thanked me for washing his hoodie that had been sitting in the laundry room for a week. I told him it was no trouble. He looked at me longer than expected, not in a way that felt wrong, just searching. Then he looked away, and the moment dissolved. I noticed how he avoided eye contact with his father. When Mark spoke, Ethan nodded without engagement. It wasn't rebellion. It was fatigue. Divorce leaves echoes that people mistake for silence. Maybe that's what I recognized in him, the same quiet residue I carried after my own failed marriage. We were both learning how to exist around unfinished emotions. On Sundays, Mark insisted on family breakfasts. He'd make pancakes, the only thing he could cook without supervision. We'd sit together under practice routine of small smiles and syrup. Those mornings almost felt normal until Mark's phone buzzed and his attention drifted. Ethan would disappear into his room and I'd collect plates, wondering why comfort always arrived in fragments. One afternoon, after Mark left for a business trip, I decided to clean the pool. The air was heavy, the sun too bright. As I skimmed leaves off the surface, I saw Ethan's reflection in the sliding glass door behind me. He wasn't staring, just walking through the living room, but my pulse jumped anyway. When I turned, he was gone. I told myself it was coincidence. The mind notices patterns when it's starved for meaning. That evening, he knocked on my door to ask if I needed help with the groceries. His tone was polite, rehearsed. I thanked him and said I had it covered. He lingered, then mentioned he'd be studying late. It was nothing, a fragment of normal conversation, yet it carried a strange charge, like the house itself was holding its breath. When he left, I felt both relief and guilt, though I couldn't explain why days passed in a blur of chores and quiet dinners. The pool became my journal. I poured my thoughts into its stillness. Each stroke in the water erased a little tension. Each exhale softened the ache of solitude. I stopped thinking about who might be watching, stopped caring whether anyone noticed me at all. Freedom often hides inside resignation. Then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered against the windows, thunder rolled across the sky, and the power flickered. I sat by the patio door, staring at the pool lit by lightning. In that flash, I saw my own reflection alone, older than I felt, a little lost. It wasn't the image of a woman newly married. It was the face of someone trying to convince herself she was happy. The next morning, the world smelled clean again. Mark texted that his flight was delayed, another day gone. I brewed coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and watched Ethan step outside to feed the dog. He moved with the awkward energy of youth, trying to appear grown. When he noticed me through the glass, he gave a small nod before walking away. For some reason, that small acknowledgement warmed me more than the coffee in my hand. It wasn't attraction, just the relief of being seen. By the end of that week, I realized I knew everything about this house, the creak of the hallway floor, the pattern of light on the walls, the sound of footsteps moving between rooms. What I didn't know was how to make it feel like home. I kept waiting for a sign that I belonged here, that Mark and I were building something real. But the silence kept stretching wider each day, until even the water outside seemed to echo it back at me. One evening, as the sky turned copper, I slipped into the pool again. The water was cooler than usual, almost sharp against my skin. I floated there, eyes closed, thinking about how easy it is to confuse stillness with peace. Somewhere behind the windows, the house glowed softly. I imagined Mark buried in spreadsheets, Ethan lost in headphones, each of us in our separate worlds, pretending it was family. When I finally climbed out, the first chill of evening brushed against my shoulders. I wrapped myself in a towel and looked back once more at the house. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw movement near the upstairs window, a curtain shifting, maybe a shadow. Then it stilled. I told myself it was the wind. I always told myself that night, lying in bed alone. I couldn't shake the sense that something in the balance of this home had shifted. Not enough to name, but enough to feel. It was the beginning of a change I didn't yet understand. A quiet prelude to choices waiting just beneath the surface, like reflections trembling on water. The days after the storm felt heavier, though nothing had truly changed. Mark returned home distracted, carrying the usual fatigue that clung to him like a shadow. He talked about meetings, delays, deadlines, things that filled space but meant little. I listened, nodding when required, smiling when polite. Our conversations had become choreography, familiar steps performed without feeling. He didn't notice the exhaustion behind my eyes, and I stopped expecting him to. Ethan moved quietly through the house, polite as ever. There was a politeness between us that bordered on distance, like we were both afraid to disturb the fragile peace holding this family together. Sometimes I heard him come home late from work, soft footsteps across the living room, the sound of the refrigerator door opening, then silence. He never lingered near me, never crossed any line, but I always knew when he was there. Awareness doesn't need words. It hums beneath the surface, subtle but undeniable. One afternoon, I came home from the store to find the back door slightly open. A breeze moved through the kitchen, fluttering a napkin off the counter. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I stepped outside, I noticed the pool light glowing faintly, ripples glistening, even though no one had used it that day. I turned it off and stood there, uneasy. Maybe Mark had forgotten, or maybe I had pressed the switch by accident that morning. But something about it felt deliberate, as if the house was trying to tell me I wasn't as alone as I thought. That evening, while washing dishes, I caught a faint reflection in the glass Ethan walking past the patio. It wasn't unusual. His room faced the backyard. Still, a strange current ran through me, a twinge of awareness I couldn't dismiss. When he came into the kitchen moments later, his tone was neutral, asking if I needed help. I told him no, forcing my voice steady. He hesitated, then nodded and left. Nothing inappropriate was said, yet the silence after he walked away lingered longer than it should have. I told myself I was imagining it all. Loneliness can warp perception. When you live in emotional quiet, even a glance feels like thunder. I tried to rationalize the unease, to blame it on boredom or nerves. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The air in that house had changed denser, more watchful. A week later, Mark left again for another trip. I stood in the doorway waving goodbye, his car pulling away while I counted the days until he returned. That evening, I made tea and sat near the pool, letting the reflection of the porch light ripple across the water. It was soothing, hypnotic. My phone buzzed with a message from Mark, short, rushed, affectionate in theory, but hollow in tone. I didn't reply. The words, "I miss you," lose their weight when they become routine punctuation. When I rose to go inside, I had the sudden sense that someone was behind me, the kind of awareness that crawls across your skin before logic catches up. I turned quick and sharp, but saw nothing, only the curtains shifting through the glass, the faint hum of the air conditioner. Still, the feeling didn't fade. That night, I barely slept. Over the next few days, small things began to bother me. A towel moved from where I left it. A pair of shoes that weren't mine placed near the pool steps. Once, I found the back gate slightly ajar, though I was sure I'd locked it. It was all harmless, explainable, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. My heart told me what my mind refused to admit. Someone had been watching me, maybe not with malice, but with intent. One afternoon, the truth slipped into view. I had just finished swimming, the water calm and glistening under the sun. As I reached for my towel, my eyes lifted instinctively toward the kitchen window. A shadow moved behind the curtain, a brief, unmistakable motion. Ethan. He froze when our eyes met, his expression unreadable through the glass. Then the curtain fell back into place. The world seemed to stop for a moment. I stood there, every nerve alive, unsure whether to feel anger or pity. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally went inside, the house felt like a stranger's. Ethan wasn't in the kitchen or living room. His bedroom door was closed, and I heard faint music playing. I stood outside that door, my hand almost rising to knock, but I didn't. I couldn't. What would I say? That I'd seen him? That I felt exposed, not in body but in spirit? There was no word for the kind of intrusion that isn't physical but emotional. Instead, I walked away and locked myself in my room. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed, the darkness thick around me. My mind replayed every small moment between us, the lingering glances, the polite gestures, the hesitations. I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, a trick of light, anything that kept me from naming it. But denial doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. The more I thought, the clearer it became. Ethan's quietness wasn't indifference. It was observation. The realization brought no anger, only sadness. Maybe he didn't mean harm. Maybe it was confusion, curiosity, the blurred perception of someone young and uncertain. Still, a boundary had been crossed, one too fragile to repair with apologies. And deep inside, a question began to form that frightened me. Had I, in some unspoken way, invited this attention? Had my loneliness been loud enough to answer? In the days that followed, I avoided the pool. I kept curtains drawn, stayed busy with housework, anything to silence my thoughts. Ethan remained distant, polite, but withdrawn. If he knew I had seen him, he gave no sign. Yet every encounter passing him in the hallway, exchanging brief words at breakfast carried an invisible weight. The air between us had changed. Thick with awareness, neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Mark called from the airport one evening, cheerful and unaware. He asked if everything was fine. I said yes, my voice steady, my heart hollow. After the call, I stood by the window, looking out at the pool shimmering faintly under the porch light. It looked peaceful again, almost innocent. But I knew better now. Stillness doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it hides what we're not ready to face. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the siding, the faint creak of footsteps upstairs. My pulse quickened, every sound amplified. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, nothing more. But the truth was, I no longer trusted my own sense of calm. Something fragile had cracked inside me. A line once clear, now blurred beyond repair. By morning, the sunlight looked different, harsher somehow. I went outside, poured coffee, and stood by the pool. Its surface was perfectly still, yet it reflected nothing of comfort. The reflection staring back wasn't the same woman who had found peace here weeks ago. It was someone alert, cautious, changed. I realized then that once you sense unseen eyes upon you, you never fully return to ease. Trust, once fractured, doesn't heal cleanly. It leaves a scar you learn to live around. I didn't tell Mark. Some truths only deepen loneliness when spoken aloud. Instead, I carried the silence like a secret, not to protect Ethan, but to protect the fragile illusion that our family still functioned. I convinced myself it would fade, that distance and time would dissolve the tension. But deep down, I knew that once awareness enters a house, it never really leaves. It lingers, waiting for the next quiet moment to remind you that nothing is as private as you wish it were. The silence between us stretched into something almost tangible. Days passed where the house felt like a museum of unspoken things, every sound measured, every movement cautious. Mark was back home, but his presence didn't change much. He carried his usual briefcase of exhaustion, his mind elsewhere, and his affection scattered across responsibilities. I found comfort in routine laundry, groceries, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting. Avoidance became my form of peace. Ethan was quieter than ever. He left early, came home late, and when our paths crossed, there was a hesitation in him that hadn't been there before. He avoided my eyes, spoke only when necessary. I thought about confronting him 100 times, rehearsed a dozen versions of what I might say. But every time, words dissolved before leaving my mouth. I didn't want to shame him. I didn't want to expose myself either. There was guilt in me, too, not for anything I'd done, but for what I'd allowed to linger between us. It was a guilt made of glances and silences, not actions. One afternoon, Mark called to say he'd be late again. The familiar ache returned, dull and predictable. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after hanging up, staring at my reflection in the glass of the back door. The woman looking back seemed older, sharper around the edges. I wondered when my life had turned into a string of things unsaid. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped expecting warmth and started surviving on understanding. And even that, I was losing. The tension with Ethan reached its peak quietly. No explosion, no confrontation at first, just the slow tightening of the air. That evening, while putting away dishes, I sensed movement behind me. When I turned, Ethan stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, uncertain. His voice was low when he spoke. He said he wanted to talk. There was a tremor in his tone that carried both fear and apology. I nodded, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between words. He started haltingly, saying he hadn't meant to make me uncomfortable. He admitted that after his mother's death, the house had felt cold, and when I arrived, it finally seemed alive again. He said he didn't know how to act around me, that sometimes he found himself watching just to make sure I was real, not another person who would leave. His words were honest, maybe too honest, and I felt something inside me twist painfully. I wanted to be angry, but what I saw in his eyes wasn't malice, it was confusion. Loneliness, longing for connection in its most human, clumsy form. I told him that boundaries matter, that kindness doesn't need to blur into something else. My voice shook even though I tried to keep it steady. He looked ashamed, his gaze falling to his hands. There was no accusation in my tone, no lecture, only weariness. I told him he deserved peace, not punishment, and that we both needed distance to find it. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air felt fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it. Then he said something that stayed with me. "You're the only one who sees me." Simple words, yet they carried the weight of every quiet dinner, every empty evening. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was too much truth in them. For a second, I saw not a young man, but a reflection of myself, a person trying to be noticed, trying to matter in a house full of ghosts. Mark came home later that night, cheerful and oblivious, talking about deadlines and meetings. I listened, pretending nothing had happened, though my thoughts burned with the memory of that conversation. Ethan stayed in his room, the door closed, his music louder than usual. I could sense his embarrassment, his wish to disappear. The house returned to silence, but it wasn't the same silence anymore. It was loaded with understanding and restraint. The next morning, I found a note on the counter. A simple apology written in Ethan's careful handwriting. He said he was sorry for crossing a line, that he respected me, and that he would give me space. I folded it quietly and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it's just choosing not to let shame define what comes next. Over the following days, life returned to its usual rhythm. Mark left for work before sunrise. Ethan buried himself in classes and shifts, and I busied myself with small domestic rituals that kept me from thinking too much. But even in the routine, a subtle tension lingered, a quiet awareness of what had passed between us. It wasn't danger nor desire, just the echo of an unspoken boundary we both now respected. One evening, Mark suggested we all have dinner together. It felt strange, the three of us at the same table again, pretending to be a family. Conversation stumbled at first, but eventually found rhythm. Ethan spoke about school, Mark about business trips, and I about nothing in particular. When Ethan glanced at me across the table, the look in his eyes was different, mature, steady, apologetic. I met it briefly and then looked away. Understanding had replaced discomfort, and that was enough. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the window watching the pool shimmer under the moonlight. I thought about the conversation, about how delicate human boundaries can be when loneliness fills the spaces love forgets. I wondered whether Mark would ever understand the quiet fractures that form in a house like ours. The kind that don't come from betrayal, but from absence. I realized then that emotional infidelity isn't always about desire. It's about the hunger to be seen. The way two lost people can mistake empathy for affection. What had happened between Ethan and me wasn't love, nor was it sin. It was the meeting of two people standing on opposite sides of grief, both searching for warmth in a cold house. The shame didn't lie in the moment. It lay in how easily such moments are misunderstood. That night, I promised myself to repair what could be repaired. To speak more, to listen more, to stop letting silence dictate my life. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Mark was good at hiding behind routine. And I was good at pretending not to mind, but still, I wanted to try. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that secrets, no matter how innocent they seem, always find a way to surface. Before I went to bed, I stepped outside for one last look at the water. The surface reflected the stars, calm and undisturbed. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel watched. The air felt lighter. Whatever had needed to be faced had been faced. The quiet that remained wasn't guilt anymore, it was relief. A fragile kind, yes, but still relief. When I closed the door behind me, I realized that sometimes redemption doesn't arrive as forgiveness from others. Sometimes it comes as the simple act of acknowledging what went wrong, learning from it, and choosing to walk forward without looking back. Time has a strange way of softening edges. Weeks passed quietly, and the weight that once pressed against the walls of that house began to fade. Ethan kept his promise. He was polite, reserved, and distant in the right ways. Our exchanges became brief, functional, even comfortable. The tension that had once lived between us settled into understanding, something silent but not heavy. It was the kind of peace that comes after a storm, not perfect, but enough to breathe again. Mark noticed the calm too. He said the house finally felt normal, though he didn't realize how fragile that normalcy was. I didn't correct him. Some truths serve no purpose when spoken. Instead, I learned to move through my days with quiet acceptance, no longer searching for something missing, just trying to preserve what still remained. Ethan began preparing for college. The house filled with boxes, papers, plans for the future. Mark was proud, his excitement genuine, and for the first time, I saw him light up when he spoke to his son. Watching them together, I felt both joy and distance. They were connecting again, and I had become a witness instead of a participant. That realization hurt more than I expected, yet it also brought relief. Maybe that was what I had wanted all along, for them to find each other without needing me as the bridge. One evening, Mark suggested we celebrate before Ethan left. We had dinner on the patio, laughter echoing softly into the night. It felt almost easy. Ethan talked about the city, his plans, his nerves. I smiled, offered advice, careful to keep my tone light. There was no tension in his eyes anymore, only gratitude. I could see he had grown in those silent weeks, found a balance between apology and forgiveness. That quiet maturity reminded me of how we both had been forced to learn boundaries the hard way. After dinner, I stayed outside as they went in. The sky was clear, the pool glowing faintly under the porch light. It had been weeks since I'd gone near it. I stood at the edge and stared at my reflection. It looked different now, calmer, grounded, less fragile. The water that had once felt like an escape now looked like a mirror, showing me everything I had refused to see. I realized that the person I'd become in this house wasn't the same woman who'd first arrived. I had walked in wanting love, validation, belonging, but what I'd found instead was self-awareness, born out of mistakes and silence. The next morning, Ethan came to say goodbye before leaving for college. He looked nervous, though he tried to hide it. I wished him well, handed him a small gift, just a book of essays about resilience and forgiveness. He thanked me quietly, then paused before leaving. He said, "You helped me more than you know." I nodded but didn't respond. Some moments don't need words. They just need to be felt and released. As his car pulled out of the driveway, I felt an unexpected calm. Whatever had passed between us was over, sealed by understanding and distance. The days that followed were quieter, emptier. The house seemed larger, its silence less suffocating but strangely hollow. Mark filled it with talk of work and travel, as if motion could replace meaning. I didn't argue or complain. I had stopped expecting him to change. Instead, I started focusing on small things, gardening, cooking for myself. For once, my routines were mine, not built around someone else's absence. One evening, while watering the plants, I caught a glimpse of the pool again. The surface shimmered in the twilight, perfectly still. For a moment, I was back to that first day, the nervous bride, the hopeful woman trying to fit into a new life. But now I understood what I hadn't then. Peace doesn't come from being seen by others. It comes from seeing yourself clearly, even when the reflection isn't flattering. Mark joined me outside, standing beside me in the fading light. He asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it. He didn't notice the layers beneath that answer, but that was fine. Not every truth has to be shared to be real. He reached for my hand, a simple gesture that felt strange at first, but I didn't pull away. We stood like that for a while, quiet, connected only by the decision to keep trying. Sometimes that's all a marriage can be, an agreement to keep standing side by side, even when love has softened to something less certain but more forgiving. Later that night, as I sat by the window, I thought about how easily a home can hold both guilt and grace. How a single mistake, even one born of loneliness, can teach you what loyalty really means. It isn't about perfection or purity. It's about honesty, the courage to look at what's broken and still choose to mend it instead of hiding it. I had spent months pretending everything was fine, when in truth, I had been learning how to be honest with myself, with others, with silence. As weeks turned into months, Ethan's absence became part of the rhythm. He sent messages occasionally, updates about classes, photos of campus life. His words were respectful, kind, brief. There was no tension, no residue, just a quiet acknowledgement of what we had both learned. I responded warmly but sparingly, careful to leave the past where it belonged. Forgiveness, I found, was less about absolution and more about acceptance. You stop trying to rewrite what happened and instead let it become part of who you are. Mark remained who he'd always been, steady, distant, occasionally thoughtful. I no longer tried to fill the silence between us. I let it exist. We started walking together in the evenings, not saying much, but those quiet steps meant more than any forced conversation. There was something healing in just existing beside each other without pretending everything was perfect. Love had changed shape, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. It had matured, weathered, learned restraint. One night, I returned to the pool. The air was cool, the stars clear. I dipped my hand into the water, watching ripples distort my reflection. For the first time, I didn't see regret there. I saw a woman who had faced herself fully and survived it. That was enough. The pool that had once symbolized secrecy and confusion now felt like closure. A reminder that even murky water eventually clears if left undisturbed. As I turned to go inside, I realized the story of what had happened in that house wasn't about infidelity or desire. It was about emptiness, about how people reach for warmth in the wrong places when they stop feeling it where they should. It was about how silence can twist even innocent moments into something complicated. But most of all, it was about forgiveness, the kind that doesn't erase the past but allows you to keep moving through it without shame. I closed the door behind me and looked around the quiet living room. Everything was still. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in, imperfect, human, real. I knew there would always be shadows, memories that surfaced in quiet hours, but I also knew they no longer had power over me. The reflection I carried now wasn't about who had watched me once. It was about how I had learned to finally see myself. And as I turned off the lights and walked toward my room, I whispered a quiet truth that needed no witness. Peace isn't found in forgetting. It's found in forgiving yourself for what you did when you were lost, and choosing every day after to walk toward the light instead.